this webinar, and we'll post it for your review later on our website at radicallybetteragile.com. So we would like to start off with just a brief introduction of ourselves. I see we've got a lot of repeat attendees on the call today, so that's awesome, and I'll keep this short and sweet then. So my name is Denise Jarvie, and I have a very long history with doing work in the Department of Defense, mostly on the contractor side. I have a rich history of earned value management, and as you can see on my slide here, I've worked with a lot of different companies. I started out in the Army, and then I started working with Northrop Grumman out in Colorado, where I really started to understand and work in the program management office. And that's where I kind of got the really good experience on big government programs with earned value requirements. At that point, I learned just a little bit about Agile. Some of the teams within that organization were doing some Agile practices for just their software part of the project. So over the years, I became really an expert in earned value, and then started traveling around with Humphreys and Associates, doing a lot of consulting and working with many of these other companies that you see on the screen. I decided to take just a little break from the consulting world, and I became a program manager here in upstate New York, where I live right now, at a commercial industry. And I would say that's where I really got my feet wet in true Agile, and specifically Scrum. So I became a Scrum Master, an Agile coach. I just, kind of experienced it myself firsthand. And now I've come back into the Department of Defense world, and I am starting to really see that, organizations within the Department of Defense want to be Agile, but they also have earned value requirements and more stringent compliance that they need to deal with. And so I think that I have unique experience that allows me to understand both sides, and I think that I can hopefully provide some best practices for you today on not just Agile or EV, but Agile and EVMS integration. So Jess, I'll switch it to your slide here.
Sounds good. Thanks, Denise. So I actually met Denise at this on the commercial side. I had been working for that company for a couple of years and was there when we were traditional program management and migrating towards more of an Agile approach. So I got to be part of one of the first beta teams, a Scrum Master on that. I got to meet Denise, and we just instantly gelled. I had a huge respect for what she did in the government sector and the techniques that she brought to the commercial world. And we ended up growing together as Agile coaches, and eventually Denise left, and it was so sad. So she gave me a call and was like, hey, Jess, do you want to create an earned value and Agile workshop? And so that kind of started this journey that we're on together, really just bringing all of what we understand and know about traditional requirements and the reporting requirements and performance measurement that we're so used to with our program management backgrounds to the world of Agile and Scrum, and really using these iterative development approaches. So since then, I've done a lot of work in the government sector, training and teaching, and basically just traveling with Denise and sharing our best practices. Denise and I have also done a number of keynote speaking and some work for the NDIA Agile Working Group. So there's actually going to be a paper that's released in the next, I'm going to say, a couple of months about hardware and software Agile development techniques for the government sector. And we wrote that, so we're kind of excited. So we've done a lot of branching out from there, and we're doing work in the for-profit, the nonprofit, and the government sector. So really excited to share our tips and tricks with you guys for Agile and earned value integration today. So welcome, everyone.
All right, so we have our webinar broken down into a few different topics for you today, all surrounding how do you become Agile and also be compliant with earned value management. So one of the very first things that happens when Jessica and I come into these organizations that are, defense contractors, and they're struggling with this predicament about how to be Agile, how to be compliant, one of the first things that we see is that sometimes they get a request for proposal, and they're not sure how to respond to it for many different reasons. So I have just a couple slides I want to talk to you about, tell you some stories about our experience with RFPs. So there's a couple different scenarios that I'm going to talk about. The first one is really responding to a traditional RFP. So you get this RFP and it really is quite waterfall in nature, but you might want to use some type of agile development approach to actually execute the scope. And there's a lot of reasons for that because agile has a lot of benefits. But how do you handle this traditional, more waterfall type RFP? So I'm going to give you just a few of the challenges and then also some of my recommendations and solutions for this particular, predicament, I guess, or scenario. So some of the challenges that I've seen when I'm at these organizations is, and they receive this, traditional waterfall RFP, is that the work breakdown structure and the statement of work is very waterfall in the way that it's architected. So, you'll see things like a PDR, a CDR, all these different technical reviews that have to happen, and the scope is architected in a way that it's big design up front, then the development and testing later. And so that's just the typical waterfall flow. And the organization, the contracting organization, has to figure out how can we, have scrum teams or use Kanban and be very agile and still fulfill all of the statement of work in the WBS. And how should we say that in this response to the RFP? Another thing that I see is that the requirement details are defined up front. So all of the details of the requirements are laid out, and I have heard many people say, well, how are we supposed to be agile if everything is lined up front, and how do we organize and orchestrate that in this RFP response? And I mentioned the reviews in Agile. When I say the reviews, I'm talking about the technical reviews. So the systems engineering technical reviews or the setter reviews, like the PDR, the CDR, those things that are very waterfall. In Agile, we don't want to necessarily have those stringent reviews, across the entire life cycle of the project. We might want to have more iterative reviews. And so how do you address that if you've got these, phase gates or milestones surrounding those technical reviews? And then the other challenge that I see a lot is that, honestly, there's a much higher level of customer involvement that really is needed if you're going to be agile. And so if you're responding to a waterfall RFP but planning to execute the scope in an agile way, then how do you communicate that need for the customer to really be involved? So we'll definitely walk through these in a little bit more detail, but those are some of the main challenges I see when contractors are responding to a waterfall RFP. So now what do you do about that? Now, obviously, we can get into a much deeper discussion about how would I handle these challenges, but some of the tactics that I've seen work when Jessica and I are at other organizations are, if you've got this waterfall RFP and you're going to be agile, then the first thing that we help or coach these people to do is to map the agile product capabilities back to that WBS and SAL. And we'll walk you through exactly what we mean by that in the slide. So by the end of this 2-hour session, you'll know exactly what we're talking about. But it's important that you do that mapping so that you can reassure the customer that they're going to get all the benefits of this agile development approach that you've chosen, and you will make sure to satisfy all of the requirements in the statement of work, so there's no uncertainty about that piece. The next thing I have on here as far as a tactic for responding to a waterfall RFP is defining the high-level requirements, and that includes the functional requirements. It includes the interface requirements. So Jessica and I often get into very detailed and heated discussions about requirements in Agile. So if you have any specific questions on that later, at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for questions and comments, and we're also monitoring the chat as well. But what we want to do if we're Agile is at least define those high-level requirements, functional requirements, and talk about the interfaces so that we've got that systems level view when we're responding to the RFP. Also, I always talk to my clients about acceptance criteria and the importance of using acceptance criteria at all levels of the hierarchy. So if you're not familiar with acceptance criteria, it's very closely aligned to requirements. It's something that you can include at, for example, the higher levels of scope, like your epics or your features, and all the way down to the story level. And it tells you exactly what you have to complete to be done. So we'll get into that a little more, but a good approach or technique that you can use is to make sure that everybody on your team understands acceptance criteria, and that the acceptance criteria is then mapped to the requirements. Also, outlining the plan for incremental reviews. This is really important because, again, the customer involvement is higher. If you're planning to do incremental reviews, and if you guys are Agilists out there, you know that getting that feedback is so important, and incorporating your stakeholders and your customers earlier in the cycle is very important in Agile. That's something that I would like to have outlined in my RFP so that the customer understands. Otherwise, that's going to hinder you later when you're actually trying to execute using this Agile development approach. And the last thing on here is identify benefits of increased customer involvement and or identify internal stakeholders or customers proxies as necessary. So that's a kind of a lengthy little bullet there, but basically I want to tell the customer that, yes, I am going to have this iterative approach, and by the way, it's going to be so beneficial to you. It's going to reduce your risk. You're going to get a product that you like better, and we need your input, and here are all the benefits you'll get from that. And then also make sure that you're identifying who are those point of contacts on the customer side, or is it going to be, are you going to need, for example, a product owner proxy or something? So we'll get into a little bit more about that, but this is something that I see in a lot of organizations. We go to lots of different companies around the country. Well, lately it's a lot of virtual visits with these companies, but we do see people who are really struggling with responding to that waterfall RFP when they plan to execute in an Agile way. So the other type of situation we see is where you're really responding to an Agile RFP. And there, believe it or not, can be some challenges with that as well. So if the customer is really on board with Agile, which a lot of them are, I mean, a lot of the Department of Defense, Navy, Air Force, even some of the Health and Human Services contracts and RFPs that we're seeing are moving much more towards asking for Agile development approaches. And so what I see on kind of the other side of this pendulum that we're talking about here is that the customer is putting all of these sophisticated Agile development approaches and language in the RFP, and the customer wants, or the contractor wants to be Agile, but they might not know exactly how to do that, or they are Agile and they just have to still respond in a way that is compelling in this response to the RFP. So what we like to coach our contractors to do when they're responding to an Agile RFP is to describe the framework and the development techniques that you plan to use. So are you using the Scaled Agile framework? Are you using Scrum at Scale? Are you going to use Kanban, etc.? And what are those development techniques, so that the customer really understands that you know what you're talking about. You have a plan for this Agile development approach. Also, what is your approach going to be to iterative planning? Especially if you have an earned value management requirement, then you have to describe that iterative planning process and describe how it relates to the earned value management compliance. The other thing that I think is very important is to describe the process for your architecture, especially if you're doing something that involves not just software, but also hardware, firmware, and there's some interfaces and dependencies that you know that you're going to have to deal with. Jessica loves to talk about this. I'm sure we'll discuss it a little bit more. And those of you that have attended some of our other webinars know that we think that the architecture of the product is very key. And if you describe that process for your modular architecture, how you're going to reduce these dependencies in the RFP, then that's another key indicator that your company really is Agile. Also, of course, your approach to system test and delivery. So in Agile, there's a much more iterative process with a lot more test up front. And if you describe that process, then your customer is more likely to believe that you're really an Agile company and choose you. I mentioned the setter review process. Again, that's the systems engineering technical review process. And if you have an idea or a plan of how you want to approach that, like say you want to use release backlog reviews with your customer in place of, those typical waterfall phase gates, that's something that you can describe, talk about the benefits in your RFP response. And then which metrics are you going to use? Another one of our favorite topics. A lot of people say, what's the best metrics to use? And, can you tell me how to get more insight from our Agile teams that can supplement our earned value management metrics? And yes, there's a wealth of metrics out there, and we recommend you don't choose them all. Choose the ones that would be the most meaningful to you, and then specifically as it relates to the RFP, tell your customer which metrics have you chosen and how are those metrics that you're going to focus on going to actually increase the outcomes that you're looking for on your project. Also, approach for providing government early insight into the development process. So if you're a very agile company and you're going to use this iterative development approach, then you know that you're going to be able to provide even deeper insight than you would if you were just using an earned value management system, because you're showing working product. You may allow your customer to see dashboards or a deeper level of reporting coming out of Jira or whatever your agile tool is. So these are some of the things that if I was responding to an RFP that was asking for agile development, these are some of the things that I would highlight to emphasize the fact that we really are an agile company and that we're not just saying we're agile because we want to win the contract, which I've seen. So at the bottom here, I'm just showing a little snip from the 5000 series, the DoD Instruction 5000 series. If you're familiar with that, it's just the procurement documentation that the government provides. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because government customers are asking for more agile approaches in their RFPs. And they're actually changing the language in the process and the policies, and they're moving towards writing those types of requirements in their request for proposals. So you can see I just took the snip of the planning phase, which shows that iterative cycle of execution. And it has language like MVP, minimum viable product, and MVCR, minimum viable capability release. So the government itself in Department of Defense has done a lot of studies about the benefits of Agile. They've done, studies on the commercial side, and you may have read of, or be experiencing some of these benefits in Department of Defense. And so from the policy side, it's evolving, I would say, much more towards agility, and that's seen even in this software acquisition documentation. So we're seeing a lot more RFPs that are asking for agility. Okay, so I know Jessica is checking the chat, so please feel free to chat any questions and we'll do our best to help you understand this. All right, the next topic is developing a product backlog and integrating with EVMS. So this is kind of the bread and butter of, how are you going to define the product and how are you going to integrate it with earned value? So when Jessica and I go into a company that is looking to set up a new project or product and they are looking to be very agile, they say, well, where should we start? What should we do first? And this is a very important step that I think a lot of companies might not think to do as robustly or carefully and specifically as what we would recommend. And that's called the product vision. So we want the project manager or the team of people who will be working on this project or product to develop a compelling product vision that aligns everybody to what it is that we're trying to do, and not just the what it is we're trying to do, but why. And we want it to be posted on the wall. We want it to actually be something that everybody on the team can visibly see and easily understand and get behind and support. So this is actually very similar to one that we really did with a company. Of course, we had to kind of make it vanilla so that we weren't actually putting somebody's product out there. But this one says, for the warfighters who need to detect locate and direct fire at enemy ground targets. The Death Star vehicle is an unmanned ground vehicle that is controlled by a ground operator during day or night operations. It's unlike this other unmanned ground vehicle, the Titan. Our product has increased survivability, minefield transit capabilities, laser-directed attack functionality, etc. And you can see that it's a very specific way of writing a vision, the for, the who needs it, you're differentiating your product from others, and it doesn't take that long. And I think that there's a lot of benefit to doing this. And then as you decompose the scope, and as the scope of this product is dispersed to the teams, the Agile teams who are going to execute the work, they can always look at that product vision and say, okay, we're making it for these warfighters, and this is the vision. So highly recommend using this technique. The next step that we do once we've got that vision up on the wall and everybody understands it and is behind it, then we start to do a brainstorming session. It's actually pretty fun. We love to do this with customers because so much value comes out of this exercise. So we start to brainstorm what should the backbone be based on that product vision. Let's see, there we go. So we take that product vision and we start to break it down into modules or subsystems. What is the big chunks of work or scope that you wanted to develop? And we start to create this on the wall, and it becomes really the backbone of our roadmap and our backlog, which we'll get into. You could then take those modules or subsystems and break it down into a subset of that scope, which we are calling epics here. And then the same thing, break it down even further into a subset of features. And I'm going to explain what these terms mean a little bit more. If you don't know what an epic or a feature is, don't worry. We're going to talk about it, and we're also going to talk about how it relates to earned value. So once you've got this product vision, you're brainstorming, you're breaking down your work, you're deciding how to group that functionality or capability into things like modules, epics, and features, then you can start to lay it across time. And so when I say a product roadmap, this is a very simple example of what I'm talking about. You can see that there's the high-level modules, which are broken down into epics. The epics are broken down into features, and then they're organized into releases. So if you can see, this is release 1. Think of that as, like, let's say the first 3 months. What are we going to release or accomplish, execute in the first 3 months? Which features are we going to be ready to demonstrate to the customer, and how are we going to meet those customer milestones or the internal milestones that we may have? So once you've got this kind of high-level time phase product roadmap, you're in a pretty good position to ensure that you are going to be able to meet those technical objectives and criteria that may be laid out in something like your integrated master plan. I always like to show this slide because people use different terminology all over the place. So on the Agile side of the house, it's a little bit more flexible. If you're familiar with earned value, you know that it's a control account, it's a work package. The language is very specific, and it's universal across most organizations. That's not necessarily true in Agile. So I'm using modules, epics, and features because that is the language that is typically used in things like the NDIA Agile and EV guide. But I do see other terminology used across organizations. So maybe I call it a module or a subsystem, and you call it a component or a capability. That's fine. It's okay as long as you have internal agreement. So what I have seen at many organizations when I'm in helping them, get ready for an IVR or just kicking off these teams, is that everybody's confused about the language, and it's not all written down and carefully presented to the internal teams. The next thing is that it has to be written down. So I know that, process is not what you think of when you think of Agile, maybe, but I do know that it's important to document the language in some type of process so that you are all on the same page internally and that you're using that same language to communicate to yourself as well as your customers. And so the last thing on here is, of course, inform your customers. And if you can do this upfront and early, if we're talking about a big Department of Defense or other type of government program, then I would say even prior to your integrated baseline review or IBR, you're describing the language. You're saying, this is the way that we've broken down our scope. It's a module, then an epic, then a feature. And then everybody's on the same page, and it makes these discussions go so much smoother. All right. There we go. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the product backlog. So I showed you that roadmap. I showed you that I broke down scope from the subsystems to the epics and the features, and then I laid it out across time. And that was the roadmap, but what I didn't really dive into is the product backlog. So the product backlog has all of that same scope, and in fact, the product backlog has all of the scope that you plan to execute, that you know about today, and that's contractually required. It's in the backlog. Now, I don't want to make you think that I've detailed every single little thing in the product backlog, but it's there. Hey, Jess, it sounds like you might have a question.
We got a question. So when using WBS waterfalls for EVM reporting, we usually report at level 4. In Agile, level 4 is that of stories, question mark?
That's a good question. So not necessarily. In fact, I would highly discourage writing or reporting at the story level to your customer. So typically the reporting level, if you're talking about Agile, is your feature. Sometimes epic, but typically feature, depending on how many levels you choose to break down your product. Like I've seen it be module, subsystem, then themes, then capability, then epics, then features. So there could be more layers in between. But with the example that I have shown here, which is the module, epic, and feature, your feature is more like, it's actually, and I'll show you a little more in a second, your feature is aligned with the work package, and your work package would typically be the reporting level. The stories would be below the line in your Agile tool, and I'm definitely going to show you some other pictures and diagrams here in the next hour that will hit home for you on this topic. So please do circle back. Thank you for that question. And I would say that, yeah, definitely not the stories for reporting because, well, for a lot of reasons. That would be kind of a reporting nightmare, actually. All right, so the product backlog needs to be aligned with the work breakdown structure as well as the statement of work. So if I'm looking at the product backlog, I need some way to make sure that the WBS is covered. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire WBS and statement of work will be covered by Agile teams. Perhaps only a part of the work will be, people using Agile development approaches like Scrum, and some of it might be a more traditional approach, and therefore that scope wouldn't be in the product backlog. But anything that the teams, the Agile teams are going to be developing or creating, that scope should be in the product backlog, and it should map to the WBS, and it should map to the statement of work. All right. So what if you get that waterfall WBS? So we've got, a typical mill standard 881 WBS, but we want to be agile. Then what should we do? Well, as I mentioned, you really have to take the time to map the product backlog to the WBS and to ensure that all of that scope is covered. And it's kind of like an extra step. It's much better if your WBS, of course, is already broken down into those capabilities or functionality that you can easily relate to your epics and features. But if not, then you have to take the time to make sure that the customer knows that, for example, the cybersecurity systems engineering work is covered, and it's going to be covered here in your backlog. All right, so here's just an example. If I were to look at the suspension and steering, which is 1.1.5, then I would want to be able to very easily point to which epic and which feature is that scope covered under. So we just took a subset of our product backlog that I showed you on the last slide, and I'm showing you that I would want to map to that. We've actually had many customers who put that WBS number or that statement of work number, at least at those high levels of epic and feature, into their Agile tool to allow for that traceability. Okay, so this is a little bit of an older document if you think back to PARCA, which is now the Office of Acquisition Analytics and Policy, or AAP. It's a few years old, but this is the reason I'm showing you this is because even that organization recognizes that that we are moving much more towards waterfall to outcome-based agile structures in the WBS. So if you're looking at that MIL Standard 881 and some of the other documentation that's out there to help organizations develop a WBS that is compliant, you might see this typical waterfall structure like prime mission subsystem, and then you've got these CSCIs, which are very waterfall, the requirements, then the design, then the different levels of testing. But what's really interesting is that you also see some examples now in documents like this about capabilities and features, or in other words, outcome-based agile structures actually in the WBS. So Jessica and I not only work with contractors, but we've had the privilege or gotten this great opportunity to actually work with government people in different organizations, for example, the Navy, and they are writing more agile outcome-based WBSs. So we're talking to the customers and teaching customers about the fact of the difficulties of having a waterfall WBS and then really trying to be agile. Because again, what we're seeing across the board is that a lot of government organizations want the benefits of agility, but because they may not fully understand it, they do things like give you a waterfall WBS. So we're seeing strides, and we're seeing some contractors that are actually receiving more of this outcome-based structure, which is great. And if not, it's okay. You can still be agile, but then you have to do some mapping back to that waterfall WBS. All right, so this is the outcome-based work breakdown structure. So if you remember that I was telling you about the unmanned ground vehicle system, and I showed that product backlog and roadmap to you, this would relate one for one to those capabilities. So those epics and those features are actually identified here in the WBS. And in this WBS example, the levels would be your epic is here and your feature is like the platform and support. So somebody was asking me about which level are you reporting. You could have many different levels here, and depending on, first of all, what are your customer reporting requirements, and how have you decomposed your scope in an agile capability-based way, you would mark here which level is the appropriate level for reporting. So you can have a WBS that is functional, that's capability-based or outcome-based, and it can be compliant. We've seen it. And then this is the WBS dictionary. So if you guys out there have worked on earned value programs, you know that an important part is the WBS dictionary, because that's where we really describe the scope. We talk about what is and what is not included in each of these WBS elements. And that's where the control account managers are really defining their scope in a much more descriptive way than just the WBS. So this is just an example of that same WBS, but adding this additional detail in the dictionary. Okay. So now that we've talked about the RFP, we've talked about how we're organizing the vision, breaking down the product, and how we've broken down work into epics, into features, and I've touched on, kind of mapping to earn value. One of the most important things that I can talk to you about today is actually understanding that scope traceability. So somebody had mentioned stories, and I've talked to you about the backlog. So this is actually a picture taken out of just our sample JIRA project. And so here on the left is where we're calling these versions our epics. And this next layer here is our features that I was showing you. And then the stories are detailed over here in the sprint. And it's important that we understand how that maps to our earned value documentation. So in this case, I've actually put in you can easily create a new field in the tool to identify what are your SAL paragraph numbers. You could put in your WBS elements, and if you wanted to, you could even put requirement numbers. I actually have seen a lot of customers who keep their requirements in a separate tool, and I've seen some who do some requirement management in their Agile tools as well. So it's really easy to do this in a couple different ways. I mentioned just adding fields. You can customize Jira as well as many of the other Agile tools pretty easily. And you can also use labeling. So you can see here that I have platform dimensions and platform supports, identified so that I can trace the stories to the feature and to the epic, as well as to the earned value management documentation like the WBS and the SAL. So in this way, if I'm a control account manager or someone who needs to do a scope trace to ensure the teams are working on the correct work, then it's easy to do. And you can show that, demonstrate that, prove that to your customer. All right, the integrated master plan. So this is just an example. It's kind of vanilla example of one of the integrated master plans that I've recently helped a contractor with. They received something like this from their customer. And they developed their product roadmap. So again, this is the one that I showed you at the beginning where I was breaking down the scope from the subsystems to the epics to the features, and I was tying it to those milestones that I said I might have received from my customer. So this is what I'm talking about. I would take this particular, for example, increment 1 release that I received from the customer in the form of the integrated master plan, and I would then relate that to my product roadmap. And I would then show how the features that I'm working on and the epics that I'm completing are supportive of, or another way to say it is vertically traceable to that integrated master plan. So this gives you as a contractor and you as a customer the confidence that this project is under control and that the teams are doing the right work to meet those milestones that you have. So again, the product roadmap really must support the milestones in the integrated master plan. And if you have earned value management requirements and you're using agile development approaches, you can expect that your customer would want to see this type of traceability. All right, so earlier I showed just this one snapshot of the software acquisition process. Again, this is the DoD 5000 series. This is a more robust picture taken from that document, and it's got some really interesting things. I mentioned the minimum viable product, the minimum viable capability release, and you can see that they also talk about things like rapid prototyping. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but I would encourage you to take a look at this new adaptive acquisition framework. And just know that the Department of Defense is moving more towards agility, and that a lot of organizations are trying to be agile and also trying to respond to these requests for agile development on government contracts. Okay, skip that animation there. All right, so if you're not really familiar with Agile, then I'll just take a second to sort of compare and contrast Waterfall and Agile development. You can see on the top here, this pink box shows a very typical Waterfall approach where it's big design up front, you're doing all of your requirements, you're designing the product at the beginning, you have those design reviews that I mentioned, and then you're doing the development, and then integration, and finally the testing. So the point here is that the integration and testing is much further in the time of the project life cycle. And in Agile, down here in the bottom, you're delivering increments of product faster, and they have been tested. So you can see that I'm doing some of those same steps, or all of the same steps. I'm still designing, I'm still building, and I'm still testing. It's just that I'm doing this in a short iteration, which might be called a sprint. So in 1 to 4 weeks, I'm developing a small vertical slice of product, and then I'm demonstrating that to the customer, getting that feedback, and I know that there are not bugs and things that I need to fix because it's been tested. So there's a lot of benefit to this incremental iterative approach to development, and you can see that I'm erasing risk, and that's because I think that you really erase risk or reduce the chance of having a product that your customer doesn't like, or a product that doesn't pass the test that it needs to test, or doesn't meet the requirements specifications that you need it to, and you know that earlier. You know it because you're testing and because you're getting that feedback. So I wholeheartedly believe that using an agile development approach does reduce risk. All right, and I just want to make sure that everybody on the call understands the Scrum framework. So when Jessica and I go into organizations, we don't always talk about Scrum when we're talking about Agile, but if you look at any of the latest reports that have come out about the state of Agile, you'll read that Scrum is the most popular type of Agile development approaches that are out there and that are being used today across all kinds of different industries. So I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to explain the Scrum framework. The first thing you notice is that there's a sprint, a time box. And I mentioned that before. So if you look at the Scrum Guide, which is a 17 or 19 page document, it'll describe all of this in more detail, by the way, if you just want more information. What the Scrum Guide says is that the sprint, or this time box, should be very short in duration. In fact, it should not exceed 1 month, so 1 to 4 weeks. During that time, the team is going to use what's called a product backlog. I mentioned this just a couple of minutes ago when I was saying that the product backlog should be an ordered list of all of the work that you know that you need to do as of today, based on empiricism or the knowledge that you have today. The teams break the product backlog into sprint backlogs. So I've got the whole enchilada, everything that I know that we need to do to develop this product or finish this project. And then during the sprint, especially during backlog refinement and the sprint planning process, each team is pulling work from that product backlog. And that becomes the sprint backlog. Which is the ordered, prioritized list that's providing value to the customer. And it's what are we going to do, everything we need to do to get this product increment done, this thing that we're working on done in the next 2 weeks or however long your sprint is. The team is really looking at what is the sprint goal, and they're pulling in those stories, making sure they understand the work, have the right work, and that it's estimated during this first event called sprint planning. The next event that I want to talk to you about is the daily stand-up. So once we've all agreed on the goal, we've got our sprint backlog, and we're starting the sprint, then every day the team is going to meet together for 15 minutes. It could be a virtual call like this. Preferably it's, in front of a Kanban board or, a physical board on the wall. But obviously right now with COVID and everything, and people are being very innovative about how they're doing that. So if you haven't heard of tools like Miro or Mural, they're collaboration tools which can allow for a much better daily stand-up. But the purpose, regardless of which way you conduct the daily stand-up, is that the team gets together and it's like a huddle. What are we going to do today? It's the development team getting together. The product owner and the Scrum Master are there. You might have other people there as well, but each of the development team members are talking about, what did I do yesterday to move that sprint goal forward or to get us to that sprint goal? What am I going to do today to achieve that sprint goal? And by the way, what impediments do I have? What problems or blockers that might impede me from meeting that sprint goal? And that's where a lot of the benefit comes from, this visibility of any of the problems that or impediments that you might be having, this collaborative communication, and also working together to get those problems or impediments removed. Then you keep executing, the sprint goes on until the end of the sprint. You'll do something called a sprint review. Some of you might know this as a demo, which is fine. You can look up sprint review in the Scrum Guide, but most people will just say, it's a demo. And this is where the product owner is making sure to invite the right stakeholders, the right customers, and other stakeholders within the organization. And the team is actually demonstrating or reviewing what it is that they accomplished during the sprint. And they're getting that feedback. So it's important to have the right people and to get the feedback at the sprint review. And the last one is the retrospective. So this is important. This is where the teams can inspect, adapt, and they can get better as a team and produce a better product. So they're looking at what went well this sprint, what didn't go so well, and then they're choosing one thing that they can improve next time. In the spirit of this continuous improvement, they identify a Kaizen or something that they can improve next sprint. And it actually goes at the top of the next sprint backlog. So it's actually the most important thing that the team is going to work on. And this way the team is always getting better. The team is getting faster. They're identifying the issues that they're having and they're solving them. The last thing on the slide, or last couple things that I wanted to tell you about this slide, is that all of this work during the sprint results in the product increment. And that's the most important thing. When Jessica and I are at organizations, I love to attend the sprint review. I can tell you so much just from going to that demo. Are you actually showing working product? Do you have a physical product or working code, or demonstrating that piece of hardware, whatever it is that your product is? Do you have a product increment that you can show at the end of every sprint? So that's very telling. The other thing is that I'm showing you the 3 roles on here. So the only 3 roles in Scrum are the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the development team. So that's it. There's no, I'm a senior engineer level 6, or I'm a vice president or whatever. It's just, I'm the product owner, the Scrum Master, or the development team. Now, depending on how you scale and which framework you use, yes, there could be some other roles layered on top of it, but at the Scrum team level, that's it. Just product owner, Scrum Master, and development team. So I think that's all I'll say here about the Scrum framework, unless you have any questions, and go ahead and feel free to chat. And I do see one question.
Yes, it is. When creating the IMS, should IMS be created broken down based on sprints?
That's a really good question. And my answer is no. My answer is that you can include sprints in the IMS if it is just to show what work is being done during that sprint. But what I would not want to see is logic tied to sprints. Because again, sprint is just a time box. That's like saying January, February, March in the IMS, which is not a valid critical path. That's not a valid logical sequencing of work. And so what I want to see is the scope in the IMS. And specifically, I want to see the critical path at the feature level. Again, you can have releases, you can have sprints, like at the like if you're using MS Project, it would be at the top in like a summary bar of, if I click on sprint 2 or release 3 or whatever, I might want to see what scope will be accomplished during that time box, but I would not want to see sprint 1, sprint 2. Yes, and Jessica said it could be in the text field. Yeah, as long as there's not logic there, and what you're actually wanting to do is to have a valid critical path that is tied to scope, not time. All right, so earlier, I guess on a couple slides, I had mentioned the 5000 series, and I had also mentioned the setter or the technical reviews that are typically in a traditional, waterfall development approach, and a lot of the Department of Defense contracts are still requiring these phase gates or milestone reviews, such as your technical reviews, system requirements reviews, PDR, CDR, that type of thing. So what we used to see, and still do in some cases, is what I'm showing on the top, your more traditional reviews, and it's just kind of laid out sequentially, and it is big design up front, all the requirements are done, then all of the design. And so what we're seeing organizations move to, especially if they have a customer who is willing to participate in this, which I will admit is key, then you're moving to a much more iterative approach to the technical reviews. So of course, it's still very important to make sure that you have a robust review process to ensure that you have a good systems engineering technical base, and that you're creating and developing the work that you should. But it's just that you do it in a more iterative way. So for example, you could do release backlog reviews at each release, where your customer actually comes to your release planning, they're coming to your higher levels or system level demos, and you're demonstrating the work that you're doing, and you're iteratively kind of checking the boxes on all of these typical phase gate reviews that you might have done all up front or all at once. And then you just layer on. So we know we've gone through release 1 with our customer. We fulfilled the different functional reviews, design reviews, test reviews, and verification reviews for that particular scope that we've accomplished during the sprints in release 1. And then as we move into doing other features, completing other features in epics in release 2, then we do those same types of reviews iteratively. And then at the end, when you're done with your entire product or project, then it's kind of like dotting the I's and crossing the T's, or tying a bow on it, if you will, because the customer already knows what you've been working on. So it's definitely a much better approach. Certainly something that you have to coordinate with your customer, but we're seeing it work, and we're seeing it work across a lot of the different government organizations that we support. All right, so customer involvement, like I said on the last slide, is so key, especially for agile development. So communication is key, and I highly recommend engaging before the IBR. So a lot of times I've worked with customers maybe a little later in the process, and they did not tell their customer and have these robust discussions about their agile approach prior to IBR. And what I've seen happen is that there's surprises at IBR, and that they spend a lot of time talking about what is this agile approach and what does a feature mean and what is an epic, instead of looking at the baseline and having that robust discussion about the plan and the risks associated in the technical scope, etc. So I recommend engaging with the customer prior to the IBR. I recommend release backlog reviews, which is what I talked about on the last slide. It's a really good communication tool. It allows you to get that feedback from the customer and ensure that you're on the same page with what's in the backlog, what's prioritized, and what's the plan for this, say, next 3 months. Another really good time to engage your customer and have your customer involved is during the system demos and technical reviews. So maybe the customer can't attend every sprint review, but they could come to the higher level system demos or technical reviews that you have, for example, at the end of each release. So it's important to identify when you expect your customer to be there. And if you're the customer, you have to, of course, agree to that. And then you'll have that better communication. And get feedback. That's the most important thing. That's the whole reason we invite the customer and do these demos, is so that we can elicit the feedback from the customer and internal stakeholders, and then we can adjust if we need to make sure that we're developing that good product and reducing that risk. Okay, here's one other question that I get all the time. It never fails. Somebody always says, Denise, what do you think about, what if the customer is the product owner? Who should be the product owner? And my response to that is that I typically don't see customers as product owners, but I have seen it happen that way in a couple of cases, particularly in health and human services programs that I've worked on. I will say that there's some pros and some cons to this approach. So if the customer is product owner, I have seen product owners who are also the customer that want to add to the backlog, that might want to change the backlog based on, their developing priorities or additional scope that might not actually be on contract. So that can be, it's like the scope creep issue. That can become a problem. And the second problem that I see with the customer as the product owner is time and availability. So in a lot of these Department of Defense programs, they're huge, and the customer has multiple contracts and contractors that they're working with, and so the product owner really has to be available to the teams. You could think of the product owner in this case at that scaled level, and that could work a little bit better. But typically we recommend that the product owner is actually internal to the contractor, and that the product owner spends a lot of time with the customer and is spending half of their time understanding what those customer needs are, interfacing with the customer, and then bringing that back to the teams. That seems to work a lot better, but I don't know, again and again, I get that question. So, all right. So a lot of times I work with people who are in the PMO. They might be very smart people who are earned value management experts, and they are understanding that Agile is kind of becoming very, very popular, that they're seeing this on the projects that they're supporting, and they want to understand about Agile, but they get kind of wrapped up with, well, what about earned value? What about these other compliance and reporting concerns that I have? And so what I coach them to do is to not break the 3-5-3. The 3-5-3 is what I just showed you on that Scrum framework picture when I talked about the roles, the events, and the artifacts. So there's kind of a nice recap of that for you here on the screen. And also just the principles and values of Agile and Scrum. So if we're walking through some of the things like, working software is the primary measure of progress, and business people work together, have face-to-face communications. Some of these principles that we value so much in Scrum don't actually have to change. Hi, Jess.
Hi, I have a question. Are there projects that are better suited for a waterfall approach versus an agile approach?
Yes, I would say I love agility, and I think that Agile can be applied to many, many things. But I would say if you have a more like sustainment type of work, or something that you're doing very similar types of effort, in sustainment and operations, that something like Scrum might not be the best approach. I would like to say though that Agile is kind of a bigger umbrella, whereas Scrum is what I'm talking about now, is used for more complex development approaches, but other things that fall under the Agile umbrella, such as Kanban, for example, could be used. So I think, yes, there are some projects that are suited more towards Agile development approaches than Waterfall, but I think that even on those, you could still apply some of these Agile techniques like Lean and Kanban.
A funny analogy, I have to say, add on to this.
Sure, yeah.
When we were at a client, we got this analogy, and it stayed with me. And it was about Agile being like if you were to go to the supermarket and you would pick up one ingredient from your grocery list and then drive home, drop it off, and turn around and go back and get another one and drive home. And Denise and I kind of shook our heads, because to us, being agile means using the right tools and being smart with the way that you work. So if you already have an itemized ingredient list and you really actually know specifically what you need to buy, then you go to the store once and you buy it all and you do it just like that. But if you're doing something really organic and original and creative and new, you're coming up with a new recipe. To all of my chefs that are on here today, you would go to the store and you would get an ingredient, come back and create something with it, and then I need to have this other essence or this other rare ingredient. I'm going to go back to the grocery store and find it. And sometimes you have to go to different stores. So I think the interesting thing here is that use what makes sense. That's our big thing. Denise and I are not, we don't favor either one of the approaches, whether you're talking about Scrum or Kanban. We don't favor frameworks, and we're one of the ones that are like, let's try to integrate Agile and earn value, because we have to have both right now. So yeah, I would say our general response is it depends, and if it's something that's rinse and repeat, please don't use it. I mean, go ahead and use something that makes sense for you.
Yes, thank you so much for adding that. And then I see we have another question here, so I'll read that. Who do you typically see in the equivalent role of the product owner from a traditional development environment like SE, software architect, PE, PM? I would say that it needs to be somebody that has a very deep technical knowledge, and a systems level view is good, especially if you're looking at the scaled level of the product owner role. So I would say that, yeah, like a systems engineer, someone with that systems level thinking. Sometimes it's a control account manager as well, filling the role of product owner, especially at the beginning when they aren't, the organization isn't hiring for product owners and scrum masters, and they're kind of using the roles that they have at that time to fulfill the scrum roles like product owner. But yeah, definitely a technical expert, someone that communicates very well, because you have to communicate to the customer and then relay that down to your team or to your team. Yeah, and that has a system level view is good. All right, oh, by the way, we've also seen people in different roles succeed at product owner. I mean, I am really just I will say, mostly a project management background. I've been a Scrum Master, I've been a product owner. I've seen other people who are very, very technical. I've seen people who are software engineers also be good product owners. But just at a high level, if I'm thinking about, if I were to write a job description for product owner, what would it be? It would be those things that I said, the systems level, high deep understanding of technical technical aspect of your project, and good communication skills. Be able to make decisions too. All right, so the main point of the slide here again is to not break the 3-5-3 and actually to use the earned value to harness that Agile data. Because again, in Agile, there's a wealth of information there. You can dig down into the Agile tools and you have so much more visibility and data, and that can actually improve your earned value. So don't break the 3-5-3. Let the teams be Agile. Let the teams do good Scrum, and just harness that data to improve your earned value reporting. Don't break it. All right, so here's the mapping. A couple of people had asked some questions about this, and I think this, I'll just step through pretty quickly. This really illustrates the mapping. So if you use that same, epic feature story that I was discussing before as your hierarchy on the Agile side, then how does that relate to earned value? So your epics would equate to control accounts, and that could span releases. So think of like several months. It could be, a 6-month or a year-long epic, perhaps. And then we have the features, which equates to your work packages and your planning packages. And those should be done within a release. This one is important. The planning, when you're doing the planning for those features, I wouldn't want you to plan a feature that would exceed that release time frame. So we say typically about 3 months. It doesn't have to be exactly 3 months, but whatever that release cadence is at your organization, then your features, which are your work packages and planning packages, should be planned to fit inside that release time frame. And then stories. So stories are your quantifiable backup data. If you're familiar with that term in earned value, it's basically your predefined rationale, or the steps that you say you're going to take to complete some effort. And that's how you get your earned value % complete. I'll go into that a little more if we have time at the end of this session. And those stories are held offline in your Agile tools like Jira. So again, not in the IMS, and they should be completed within a sprint. They should be planned to complete within a sprint for sure. All right, and then this one is just kind of a put it all together slide. I have a couple of pictures like this that might just help you visualize this Agile and EV thing that we're talking about here. So at the top, I've got the releases across the top, just like I showed you on that integrated master plan or that roadmap. So what are those releases? We'll say 3-month time frames, and what the little stars represent, what are the milestones or the accomplishments that you need to achieve in order to be successful and release what you're supposed to the customer. So on the top, I'm showing the earned value management. And I'm showing the control accounts, which again, you can relate to the epic, or I put capability in case you call it that, but epic equals control account, or whatever your mapping is at your organization. And again, that spans releases. So you see epics are longer term, larger chunks of scope that are decomposed into features. The features are work packages if they're detailed planned for that particular release, and planning packages if they're out in the future. And all of these features and epics are tied to and in the integrated master schedule, as well as the product backlog. And then below the line is your Agile development. So this is where you have those 2-week time boxes or 1 to 4 week time boxes called sprints or iterations, and you're completing user stories. And again, that's what we call is your QBDs. We use those stories that the teams are completing to identify how much % complete or how much earned value have the teams completed to complete feature A, feature B, feature C, for example. And this can actually go really nicely with rolling wave planning as well. So I have an example of what that might look like. By the way, this one and a couple of the slides in here are taken from the NDIA guide, so I highly recommend checking that out if you haven't already. Jessica and I are on the NDIA Agile Working Group, so we're very, very familiar with these documents. And the rolling wave example just shows that as you're completing the features that make up capability X, you're really detail planning only the ones in release 1. And then as you get to that next time frame or next release, then you start to detail plan the next release into features and stories. And in that way, it can really coincide with your rolling wave planning from an earned value management perspective. I'll say that there is, I have had some challenges with people that I've worked with in organizations who are actually trying to implement this process just from a business rhythm perspective. So just a couple tips I've learned along the way is that don't start planning until don't wait until the day before to start doing your planning. In other words, you know about what features that you are going to accomplish in release 2, and you can have that skeleton kind of ready, and then as you're going through something like PI planning or the next release planning, and you're under the gun to get, for example, a BCR through so that you can have a baseline that's in place before the teams actually start work, you're ready to just finish that planning up based on what the teams tell you. So there sometimes is a little bit of a time crunch is what I'm saying, but that you can use this agile approach and not detail plan everything out until kind of the last responsible moment before the teams are ready to work on release 2. So I guess if you have any more questions about rolling wave or that time cadence or that approach, then let me know. And you can read about it more as well in the NDIA guide. Okay, so this is the responsibility assignment matrix. A couple takeaways on this slide really are that the documentation that's required for EVMS doesn't go away. So you still need to have your WBS, your OBS, and this matrix, which is called the RAM. And the point here, though, is that you really need a credible staffing plan. Just like you do in traditional project management, you also need a credible staffing plan when you're using an agile development approach. And the interesting and different thing is that it really does become like a team-based versus maybe a functional group that you're looking at. So you can see that I've actually listed on here cross-functional delivery teams because this organization, and actually, this is representative of a real life example when an organization Jessica and I were helping, they were responding to an RFP and they were saying, hey, we're going to use agile development and this is how our cross-functional delivery teams fit in. Here's where our CAMs are, here's our control account managers, this is the scope they're responsible for, and they have a credible staffing plan, and here's where they're represented in the matrix. So just a interesting little thing. And then of course dollarizing that. So where is the budget? And if you're familiar with the RAM at all, you know that again it's the intersection of the work, so the WBS or the scope, the what, and the who is going to do it. So on the top I have the WBS for this Vader project. I have the OBS on the side, and you can see that I've actually listed the Scrum teams and given them specific budget for the scope that they have to do. So in that way, the control account manager can say, I have these 5 Scrum teams working. This is the scope that I'm responsible for. This is who's executing the work, and this is the total budget for each of those control accounts and each of those teams. So hopefully that helps clarify a little bit of what the RAM might look like. Another technique that Jessica and I use a lot is skill gap analysis. So obviously, no matter what type of development approach that you're using, you have to have the right people to do the job and the right level of skill mix and expertise. But Jessica and I have actually used this approach to use planning poker or Fibonacci numbers to work with each of the teams and actually understand from a team perspective or Scrum team perspective, what are the skills and what are the types of teams that we actually need to develop the work. And so we'll go through, it's kind of like estimating, but you're talking about which skills do we need the most, where do we have those gaps, and then do we need to hire more people, do we need to actually stand up new teams, or do we just need to pair more and spread that knowledge across the organization so that our teams have the skills that they need to fulfill that team vision or to fill that product vision that we were talking about before. All right. So where does the control account manager fit in? So I told you before that sometimes the control account manager could be the product owner, especially in the beginning when there's not, you know, a robust, I would say, HR process for hiring these agile roles like Scrum Master and Product Owner. But at the very least, the control account manager has to interface with the Product Owner and the Scrum Master, and usually it's across multiple teams. Usually it's not like a one-for-one, one CAM, one Scrum team. So I showed you on the last slide that RAM depicted several different Scrum teams that were working on specific scope, and the control account manager would then interface with those teams to make sure they understand how the teams are executing, how's the work going, and get that performance measurement data that they need. CAMs can also attend Scrum events. I mentioned to you that the demo or the sprint review was very important. And this is a picture of a good demo where the control account manager is there. They're getting information, they're giving feedback. You can see that the team members are actually describing the work that they did. They're showing that working product. And it's not just like a PowerPoint slide behind them where one person is showing a plan or something. I think we've covered who is the CAM enough based on the questions earlier, so I'll move on to work authorization. So work still has to be authorized prior to the start of the scope, which is why I said there could be a little bit of an issue or a time crunch with that business rhythm based on when the team is ready to plan for that next release and when the baseline is in place. So just keep that in mind. The work authorization documents don't go away. That's a hard and fast earned value rule. So of course you have to authorize that work, make sure your baseline is in place. Some people ask me about the freeze period. Honestly, I think if you're doing really good Scrum and good Agile planning, the freeze period doesn't usually get in the way or hinder teams' ability to use Agile, but I think it's kind of a misnomer because a lot of contractors that I've worked with have wanted to rewrite their system description to allow for a different freeze period or no freeze period. If you're doing this release planning that I'm talking to you about and you have a roadmap and a release plan, you may not need to change your freeze period, but it comes up a lot though. All right, so any other questions so far? And if not, then Jessica is going to talk to you about the relationship between story points and hours. So we're just going to switch screens here for a second.
I can see you. Can you hear and see me? Good. Wonderful. All right, guys, so let's spice it up. We've got 45 minutes, 15 minutes left. All right, so let's talk about estimation, because I think that's another thing that can be very challenging for organizations to get right when you're moving towards Agile and you're integrating with earned value. How do you get good estimates? How do you know they're good estimates? And how do you get better at estimating when you're going for new bids? You're trying to get new proposals and contracts in place. So I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about the relationship between story points and hours, and then we're going to dig right into creating your BCWS. So the first question is, why are we having our Scrum teams estimate in story points? Why aren't we just getting our traditional basis of estimates with hours estimates from functional managers? Because that's how we've always done it, right? Well, the thing is when we estimate in hours, we're less accurate than when we estimate in terms of relative sizing. And I'll explain to you why. There's really two things that kind of hamper us from being good at telling someone how long it's going to take us to do something or how much it's going to cost. And that's that we're very, very optimistic. As humans, we're programmed to think that we're capable of doing way more than we actually are. Anybody ever get themselves into a situation where they're overcommitted? So if you have, then you understand what I'm saying. Or you have a deadline and you're up all night trying to get that work done to meet that deadline. Well, that's the optimism bias at work. Planning fallacy is really just that the further out something is from you in terms of time or distance, the worse you are at actually estimating it accurately. And that's why everyone is constantly looking for how can we get better at estimating so that we can have more profitability for our company, so that we can have better planning for what types of contracts we can take on within our portfolio, and so we can have the stable resources we need to support those programs in our portfolio. And that's really where the study done by the Rand Corporation back in the 1940s highlighted how there's an estimation technique called the Delphi estimation technique, and it really has all the ingredients of helping you overcome optimism bias and planning fallacy. And this Delphi estimation technique is relative sizing, or comparing one thing against another. They found that when they had teams that were using Delphi estimation in this study, that they had more accurate estimates than teams that were doing hours estimates or weren't using a traditional estimate at all. And so for this example, I'm going to use something kind of that we've all done around Christmas time, baking a dozen sugar cookies. So what I want to do is be able to compare something I'm familiar with and I know what it takes to do it against something that I don't know about it. I'm uncertain, or I have no idea how this thing compares to the other thing. And I'm going to look at these ingredients. How does the complexity of baking lasagna for a party of 50 different than the complexity of baking a dozen sugar cookies? Is it more or less? I'm going to look at things like, is this something I naturally already have all the skills to do right now? Or is this something that I'm going to have to research and I'm going to have to think about? Is this something that involves a lot of effort? I'm going to be working for days and days on this thing. Is it something that's more or less risky? Is there a lot that I know about this thing or don't know? And also dependencies. If I do this work, am I also going to have delays associated with other pieces of work, like waiting on hardware parts? That's usually a big one we see that hurts teams. Or sometimes it's having a relation, like a sourcing department or something that you're waiting on within your own company. So we want to think about those things when we measure and think about how does one thing compare to another, instead of just saying how much time it's going to take. In this way, we get estimates that are more robust. But don't freak out, because I freaked out and Denise freaked out when we first started using story points. We were like, why are we using these? Ours were always there, but the difference is we're taking more of a robust approach at estimating, and we're thinking about things like risks, which in my experience are really at the back of the mind of your team members when you're doing risk registers and risk meetings. This puts it to the forefront, and they're thinking about it when they provide their estimate. Hours become an output. So hours are there, but now it's an output based on a whole bunch of logical thinking that they're putting into play. Like, how hard is it going to really be to do this thing? Instead of as an input. And that makes it more robust and more reliable. And it also, in the Delphi estimation technique, what they discovered was it's a very good technique to relative size one thing against another, as long as you don't have a subject matter expert there who is basically biasing everybody and anchoring them by saying that the estimate is, it is a 5-story point because I have 20 years of experience here and therefore I override anyone else's vote. So we want to have everyone's voices heard in the estimation, and that's so that we can increase knowledge saturation. I don't know about your company, but many companies that I've been to have problems with increasing their knowledge saturation. They have very seasoned employees, but they're a handful, and then they have these newer, lesser experienced teammates that come in, and you have to somehow get the experience from your seasoned individuals down into the beginners. And the best way to do it is through conversation and by describing why you think something or know something that other person doesn't know. And the nice thing about estimating and relative sizing is we get rid of wasteful conversation that will happen when we're already on the same page. If we're already on the same page, let's just vote and move on and focus our energy on discussing and getting that knowledge saturation where things are more complex and risky. And estimates are just more accurate. And you don't just have to take my word for that. There's a lot of studies out there that show and aggregate how much more accurate it is to compare one thing against the other than it is for us to estimate in hours. So we've talked about why it's important, but I didn't tell you what a story was and why we use them. A story was actually not created to be this formal thing, not the formal thing that it is today. It was actually just supposed to give you enough depth of a conversation to estimate something. Because what happens if I bring everyone together in the call and we estimate something and I didn't give you the right amount of information? Well, you might have estimated thinking about risks, unknowns, dependencies, thought, and effort, but it wasn't a good estimate because you didn't know everything you needed to know. So the 3 things you need to know to provide a good estimate is: who are you doing the work for? What exactly do they want? What need are you meeting? And why are you doing it? Those 3 things will help you be able to estimate in a good way and make sure that it's consistent. The other thing to note is that a story is supposed to be something that inspires team members to work together. And that doesn't mean that you're doing one person does another person's job. It's that they can solve problems together. And that way you have the power of more minds. They can be more creative and innovative that way. So if we're looking at this delicious chocolate cake, which to me it's 120 here, and that looks really good. But if we were to slice this cake and look at the layers inside of the cake, what we want to see is at least a few layers, because whenever you start to slice through all the ingredients of the waterfall cycle, you have the opportunity to collaborate. And you also have something that's testable. Our goal is to have something I can demonstrate to you. What better way for me to make sure I actually have a product I can demonstrate to you than to have something that's tested? So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about stories. And what I really want to make sure of is, whenever possible, I want something that's independent of other stories so I can pull it where it's prioritized by my product owner and work on it without tons of handoffs and delays. And I want it to be something that's valuable so that when I get to the end of my sprint and I'm in the sprint review that Denise talked about, I'm demonstrating something that's meaningful to you, my customer, and you're providing me with feedback that I can use to pivot and make changes where I need to. Planning poker. I can't see your faces, so I don't know the answer to this, but I don't know if you've played planning poker. It's a very fun way to relative size. It is not the only way. There's lots of teams right now who are using planning poker because we're all virtual and remote, and there's plenty of planning poker apps that you can easily use. But there's lots of other types of estimation approaches where you're basically sorting things against each other, and those are all okay. You can use any approach you want as long as you're able to relative size it and you're talking about the right things with the right level of technical discussion. The one I'm going to focus on right now is just planning poker. And planning poker is using Fibonacci numbers. And I get this question all the time: why are you using Fibonacci numbers? Well, for those of you with statistical backgrounds and with mathematical backgrounds, it's an exponential number sequence. And what we're trying to do is just make the relative comparison at such a high rate of frequency where I can pick a number out here in a range that's so much bigger, and I can compare, the size or the effort of building a notebook versus the effort of me creating a brand new iPhone. I can tell this one's much more complicated and risky than just a paper notebook, right? So the Fibonacci number allows me to quickly tie that to numbers without having to think about it. And if it was a linear number spread, it would take me forever to grab the right numbers to represent the size. It just builds so fast and it makes it easier. So the teams have these cards with numbers, or an electronic card with numbers, and they're picking the one that represents the complexity. But the trick is, and don't lose sight of this, you always have to compare it against the same things. So whenever you first start estimating, you want to capture what they estimated. So if, for our example, the car is the easiest thing, we all say it's the easiest thing to build, then that would become our reference library. For all time, whenever we go to estimate anything in the future, we'll always compare it against that car. Why is that? Anybody know? Why are we doing that? The reason we're doing that is because over time, we want the team to automate and come up with creative ways to solve the problems that they have. And so in the future, if that car was a 3-story point size, if we find some way to automatically have a robot put together that car and it's less effort for us to build it, it's still 3 points. It's just that we have found ways to automate and get creative with building that car. This means that velocity increases. Well, when velocity increases, it's because we're showing the team got smarter. The team got better at doing the same work. Not that the team is inflating story points, but that they're doing the same work, but just in more efficient ways. And so planning poker is a way for the team to use Delphi estimation techniques and everybody weigh in on the complexity of that work. Make sense? I hope so. Okay, so very, very general. Some of you may already know that. But now that doesn't really help us get all the way to the finish line, which is, as I said, the BCWS. We need to have a baseline and we need to have it fast. If we were to use planning poker for all of the scope in our program, we'd be here for years. It would take us a very long time to estimate everything in that way. And that's why I'm going to teach you about something called large scale estimation, which is a very fast way to size a lot of different pieces of scope on your program. All right, so if you're ready with me, let's take this journey then. We want to take those epics or control accounts that Denise told you about, and we want to have a technical conversation. We want to understand what it takes to be done with these giant chunks of work. And when I say control accounts, we're talking about things that are like, 6 months long. These are longer pieces of scope. So we need to know, what are our requirements? What are the internal quality standards that we have to meet? And now that we've done that, we can start comparing these epics against each other, just like I talked about, Delphi estimation, relative sizing. So you can do this with t-shirt sizing. By the way, this is an introduction to another thing besides planning poker, t-shirt sizing. So in this case, I have extra small to extra large t-shirts. Sometimes when Denise and I go into clients, we have to have extra, extra, extra small and extra, extra, extra large and medium, extra large and all the, So you make it as complicated as you need, but the point is you have buckets and you can think about complexity, thought, effort, risks, unknowns, and dependencies of doing one piece of work against another, and you can size those epics and stick them in the right t-shirt bucket. Who estimates this? Well, it's usually your product management team, your product owners, and SMEs should be there to help clarify the requirements, the acceptance criteria, and make sure the conversation is robust enough. Because I told you, all bets are off. If you estimate without understanding the technical pieces of it, then your estimates are going to be wrong. So let's pretend we're in a room with a blank white wall. And Denise and I are helping you facilitate at your company for one of your contracts, breaking the work out into all of these different pieces of scope. And let's say you're making an unmanned ground vehicle in this case. So we sort them on the wall, and then we talk about what is the easiest thing for us to accomplish. Out of all of these different choices, which one of these things is the easiest? And you guys all said to me, well, Jessica, the easiest thing for us to do is the unmanned ground vehicle cameras. So we pick that one thing. All right, so now this goes in my reference library, remember? Because from now on, whenever we talk about unmanned ground vehicle cameras, it's the easiest type of epic to do. And we're going to compare all of the other epics against it. So that means you walked around the room and put the epics into the buckets, the t-shirt sizes that they belonged in. And you're saying that something like accelerator and brake actuating systems is one of the more complicated things to do in comparison with the unmanned ground vehicle cameras, right? We take that thing in the middle, like so statistically now, I want to explain to you what we're trying to do. We're trying to get to the center of our data without having to estimate and break down every single piece of this contract in this program. We want to get to the center of our data, and we want to be able to dig so far down that we're sure that we're getting a robust estimate. So we take the thing in the middle, which in this case happens to be the security epic or control account, and we bring in more people to talk about, well, what will it take for us to accomplish this? And we break it down into work packages. And we do this exhaustively. We talk about any type of work package that we might possibly have to do to accomplish that piece of work, including things like enablers. So things that we have to do so that we can be successful that might not be exactly tied into the end user or the customer's experience. And again, now we might have to pull in different people to estimate. This could be lower level, like at the product owner level, not your product management team or your meta scrum. It's going to be lower level because they're the ones who are actually going to do the work, right? And then we're going to take that feature and we're going to break or we're going to decide, okay, guys, which one of these features is the easiest one to do out of all the ones that we have here? And in this case, they picked the intrusion detection. Great. So we give that one a 3. It's an arbitrary number. We're basically just saying this is an extra small t-shirt size. We compare the other ones against it, and then we find the center of our data. Once again, just rinse and repeat the whole way down the roadmap. we take that feature and now we bring it to our teams. Now our Agile teams are involved. And this is an interesting thing because once you start really getting in a rhythm, these teams are probably already supporting another contract or program. So you bring this to their backlog refinement session and they are already churning out estimates in backlog refinement. So they just take these features and break them into stories for you and give you an estimate. At this point, you're down at the very lowest level. You're below the line. You're below the line in the land of the QBD, I call it. And you're having them take their stories and estimate those stories using user story points. Now, every point we've talked about up until this point is not actually tied to a team. Now we're at the team level, and the team's giving us, they're literally giving us cost and duration, because story points have a currency value and they have a duration value. And I'll show you how you get that. This is how you create a BCWS, isn't this cool? So you have the team engage in planning poker, and they exhaustively write out all the stories it will take to do this one feature. They have a lot of technical discussion, and then they use their story point, and one story point has a specific dollar amount and a specific amount of duration that's associated with it. So that they're communicating back to you what it's going to take for them to do their piece of the work. And now what you have to do, if you're in program management, you're a control account manager, or you're in finance, your job's different than their job. Their job is to relative size and estimate it. It's your job to now convert it into things that make sense to us, like hours and dollars and time. So what you do is you add up the user story points, and you basically want to get all the way back through that roadmap that you made on that white blank wall. And you want to find out how many story points are in all of those other things that the team didn't estimate. So I'll show you how you do that. You take the story points that the team gave you, and you associate them with the feature points. And your goal is to go back to that feature level, or what did we say? The work package level, right? Go back to the work package level on the wall and say, how many story points are in one feature point? In this case, there were 76 story points in 5 feature points. So if we do the math, one feature point is worth 15.2 story points. And I just go back to all of the 5s, the 3s, and the 8s that were there from our relative sizing, and I replace them with the team story points. Because I don't need them anymore. The only reason I would need feature points is if I'm going to get a new requirement in the future, and I need to rapidly estimate it against the other ones that I've already estimated. But what I really need is this. I need to know how many story points are in these other features. And you might say, well, Jess, we never went and took the encryption work package or the light detection and ranging work packages to the team and had them break it down. And I would say, exactly. Because when we're estimating in this way, the point is to do it as agile as possible to get to the center of our data and to statistically get an estimate that we feel has been technically vetted, but doesn't have to be every single thing that the team's estimated. At least one work package has to be fully decomposed by each team for us to feel comfortable with the estimate. Now you're going to add up all of the story points for the feature because we want to be able to answer how many story points are in an epic, right? Because we're going to rinse and repeat, like I said before. We go back to that wall where we had put our control accounts and our roadmap on it, and we take a look at all of the epics that are there. So let's pretend that these are all the epics that we had up there with our t-shirt sizing still up there. We don't want t-shirt sizes. We want to know how many team story points would it take for them to accomplish that work. So we replace the story point value with the user story points. So in this case, it looks like a lot, and that's because this is a large contract that we're talking about. So we add up all of those story points, and that one team is now telling us it's going to take 4,408 story points for them to support my contract. And you're like, great, Jess, that means nothing to me. Well, it does actually, but now you have to do a little bit more of an analysis to figure out what does 4,408 story points mean? What is the team telling us? So the team's actually saying how much it costs and how long it's going to take, but you have to do the math to convert it. There's 2 things you need to do this math, and I'm going to talk to you about those 2 things now. Now that the team's done their work and they've sized the entire contract for you, you need to calculate the cost of the team and velocity, which velocity typically comes from your Agile tool. But if you don't know what that is, that's an average of the last 3 sprints. And that way, in case there was an anomaly and for some reason the teams did really well in one sprint and then not so well in the other 2, you get kind of your average pace at which they do work. One thing you should know is that every team has a different currency rate. So this is not unlike our actual dollar currency that we have. $1 is not the same as 1 franc or 1 euro. And so the important thing is to get it all to one currency, and so that you have what we call a normalized story point value. Don't get overwhelmed, guys. I know this is math. All right, so we want to know, how much does 1 sprint worth of work cost? Right, a lot of this information can come right from your finance department. You want to calculate the average hourly rate of your team. So you also want to, and let's say in this case it's $210 for my team every hour. So let me just show you this example here. If I have a variety of people on my team, which I'll zoom in here so you can see, chances are you will have a lot of different disciplines that are working with different labor rates. And you're also going to have that complexity where some people are 100% dedicated to your contract or your program, other people are 50% dedicated. So what you want to do is find out, how dedicated are they to my program? Which might be 40 hours, 20 hours, and then you're going to multiply that by your average hourly rate. And so for every sprint of work that they do for my contract, it's going to cost me about $75,000, regardless of what they're working on. That's very useful information. So you normally have to do this calculation once every quarter, and that's because people may leave your contract, they may be taken off of it. It may be because their dedication levels change. It could also be because there's promotions or people move to different functional groups. So I used to do this calculation for every one of my Scrum teams on my contracts once a quarter. Yesterday's weather. So that's just telling me how much work can they do. Now that I know how much it costs for them to do the work, how much story points can my team accomplish? And this is a nice example for you of a report that comes right out of Jira, which is one of the Agile tools we sometimes talk about. And you can see that this is basically telling me how many story points they accomplish in each of their time boxes. So I'll zoom back out. Story point values differ across teams, and that's because each team has different levels of experience. So what one team can accomplish in one sprint may not be what another team may accomplish, and they may think something's more difficult based on their expertise. Okay, so here's an example of that. I have Team X and Team Y. Team X tells me it's going to take 500 story points to complete my contract. Team Y says the same thing. But here's what I look at. In the reports, I see that Team X is actually capable of doing more in a sprint than Team Y. So it will take Team X 2 sprints, where it will take Team Y 2.5 sprints to do that same amount of work. So that's called normalizing points. By binding the 2 teams to the same time box, you're able to compare the 2 against each other. So whenever you need to look at a team, look at the story point velocity that they're able to accomplish, and look at what they're telling you that it's going to take for them to accomplish your contract, and you'll be able to compare the 2 against each other. The only thing they have in common is time. All right, another thing we want to ask is how many hours per point. So they gave us that 4,000 point estimate. Well, what does that mean in terms of hours? I never make teams do this conversion. It's usually, like I said, the program management group, the CAMs, the finance department. They're the ones that use this conversion factor, not the teams. You don't want teams to compare each other, and you don't want teams to stop estimating with story points and start estimating with hours, or you'll have less accurate estimates. So you want to take the number of hours per sprint and divide it by the team's pace. So what they told you that, or what you know it's going to take them to do in a sprint, like for example, 360 hours, that's what they typically will charge to your contract every sprint. And you want to divide it by the number of story points that you found using their velocity chart in their Agile tool. So they can accomplish 250 story points with 360 hours worth of work. That gives me a conversion factor of 1.44. Why do you care about that? Because every story point for that team is worth 1.44 hours. Now you've cracked the code, right? Now you can easily get a 4,000 story point estimate from them and quickly convert it into hours, which you know and love, right? So they said 4,408 story points is what it's going to take for them to accomplish the work. And I know it's worth 1.44 hours. So I can get that estimate and within a few minutes look at it and go, okay, that's 6,347 hours, right? So that's one easy way for you to be able to take their estimates and convert them into hours. Now I want to dollarize that story point. So I take their velocity, remember their pace at which they're working, and I'm going to divide it by how much it costs. So they cost $75,000, we said, approximately, to work for a sprint worth of work. And they can do 250 story points. So what that tells me is one story point equals $302.40. Great, now I have hours and I have costs. So I have to repeat all those steps that I just told you for every team. Denise and I do a great job of helping teams, like I was talking to you about taking the white wall and making the roadmap, and then helping them take that roadmap and get it dollarized and broken down into hours and duration. That's what you'll have to do when you have an Agile team to move it from hours into dollars. Now we just want to know how much is it going to cost for that entire contract. So to do this, you take the estimate they gave you when they did large scale estimation, and you multiply it by their dollar amount per point. And so it's $1.3 million for me to use that team to work on this contract. And the power of having this type of information at my prior company was that we could have a large scale estimate conducted on a brand new contract in the proposal phase, and it could be done within a couple of hours to a few days. Whereas before that, it was anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks for us to aggregate basis of estimate for our new proposals. And the frustrating part was we'd spend all of that information or all of that time and effort up front and win a fraction of those contracts. So we needed to be more efficient, have more robust estimates, so we didn't get pinched later on during the actual execution of the programs. And the other thing was we didn't just want to be fast, we wanted to be better at estimating. So if you have any of those problems with your contracts, then I highly recommend you use something like large scale estimation so that you can try to tackle that and become more efficient. I will say one thing you didn't hear me mention throughout this whole process, because we were focused on labor, is ODC, material, travel. A lot of that stuff comes naturally bubbling up when you're doing large scale estimate. When you do it, you have all the experts in the room. So they start to say things like, well, we're going to need to take a research trip and go somewhere to finish this control account. Or we're going to need to purchase testing equipment, or we're going to need to order XXX. So you start to capture that as you're going through this process, but some portion of that still has to be done in a traditional way through basis of estimates like you normally would. So I like to keep notes of who's saying, well, we're going to need to travel, or we have ODC here, so that I can have something to, poke at. And if you don't get enough information in large scale estimation about the other costs, then I highly recommend then you follow through with the product owners and the stakeholders afterwards to try to aggregate the rest of those estimates. So this is a really good way to get labor estimates. And you still have, if you're like many of the prime contractors that Denise and I work with, you'll have some portion of your contract that's Agile, another portion of your contract that's just not ever going to be Agile. So you have to get your Agile estimates aggregated and then merge them with the traditional basis of estimates. If we have time at the end, guys, I'll show you a spreadsheet that I have, because while this sounds complicated, it's necessary. Denise and I have done it many, many times. We've been very successful at helping people create their baseline in this manner. It's hard to teach it through slides for me to really get the point across. But we do have a spreadsheet, and that's what we use when we come in. So, it's not, once you do this a couple of times, you're going to get in a rhythm. You're going to find out what formulas you need. You're going to set that up, and then you just rinse and repeat. And it's something you're used to, and then they're used to it. All right, how long is it going to take? That's the next question, right? Because now you've got everything you need. It's dollarized, but you need to spread that out over time. So we want to divide the story points by the team's velocity. So if they told us it's 4,408 story points for them to accomplish the work, and they can only do 250 story points in a 2-week sprint, then that tells me it's going to take them 17, almost 18 sprints to do the work. And if I know the 18 sprints is 2 weeks, then it's going to take them about 35, 36 weeks to do the work. This is how we time phase Agile estimates. And you also want to mix in, if you know there's duration for high long lead parts, you'll want to add those in here as well. So hopefully, guys, this wasn't too heavy on the math. I apologize if it was, but the reality is if you're pursuing agility and you still have to do this type of estimation, you're going to encounter all of these types of conversions that you're going to have to do. All right, so Denise, I'm going to hand it back over to you. Let me just make you the presenter. So did we lose anybody? I guess my question would be, how are you guys doing? Have any of you had to create your performance measurement baseline, aggregating Agile estimates? Are any of you guys converting story points into hours and dollars? Have you encountered problems with that? This is an excellent time to ask. I can't hear you, Denise.
That's because I was muted. Sorry about that. Okay, yeah, I said yes. If you guys have questions, definitely feel free to unmute yourself or chat in the box. I see someone that says this is all new to me. So yeah, this is a lot to take in then if you're just starting out, but I will tell you that we have to use that technique if we're going to get a good baseline and valid estimates and combine Agile and EV. So we'll make sure to send out the slides and also the link to the video later so you can review. And you might want to review it when you're going through this with your organization.
I will say this is also not something that's like beginner level, intro to Agile. This is just true heartache from Denise and I being in the field, having to integrate Agile with their value and realizing that you need some fast way to get estimates out of the Agile teams and integrate it still with the non-Agile teams.
Yeah, I agree. Awesome. Okay, thanks, Jess. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I'm just going to go through not too many more slides, but I wanted to make sure to just talk to you a little bit more to talk about how to put it all together. So Jessica was just talking about duration and how do we know how long it's going to take to do this work. So I just wanted to recap that point a little bit and say that, again, the control account manager really is the person who has to understand all levels of the schedule, all the way from that integrated master plan, integrated master schedule, and roadmap that we talked about earlier, through the detailed plans and the release plan. And then that control account manager can bounce off the schedules with the estimates that the teams are giving and looking at those detailed reports and stuff in the Agile tools to make sure that the estimated completion date really is correct. So there's a lot of levels of schedules that I'm showing here. It's just kind of putting it all together and making sure that the detailed plans really do support the roadmap and that you're really going to meet the milestones that are set in place for your project. And one thing I did not mention when I was talking about the schedules before and the control account manager and product owner relationship and communication is that not only should the control account manager understand those schedules, but they should be looking at the team goals. So if you're using something like a Scaled Agile framework, you might be familiar with PI and PI objectives. So these are really just the release goals or the program increment goals that the teams are committing to for the next 3 months. So this is a case where Jessica and I were really working with an organization. They had many more teams, but they had several Scrum teams, several Kanban teams, and each of those teams during this planning session identified what their goals are. And so the control account managers are very aware of that and can look at whether or not the teams are meeting these goals when they're then looking at the higher level schedules and ETCs estimates. So the CAMs understand not only the release goals, but the iteration sprints, iteration or sprint goals, and then they can make sure that they're monitoring using the right metrics. So we barely touched on metrics during this webinar, but if you go to actually Jessica's LinkedIn page, Jessica Crowley's LinkedIn page, you'll see the article that we wrote about metrics there. So the next two slides just give you an overview of something that's in the NDIA guide about how to do performance measurement. And then I'm going to give you an example next. So I see you're back, Jessica. Should I answer a question before I move on? Okay.
Yes. So is the IMS built on an Agile WBS?
Yeah, so it can be built on either an Agile or a traditional WBS. When I first started out, the very first couple of slides were all about that RFP, and what I had shown was what to do when you have a very traditional RFP, which includes that traditional WBS, and then the other scenario, which is if you're lucky enough to have an Agile WBS, which is more outcome or capability focused. So either way, you need to make sure that you've planned out and decomposed your work in a way which is very outcome based, like this with the epics and the features, and then those epics and features go into your IMS. And if you have a traditional or waterfall WBS, then that's where that extra layer of mapping has to take place. What I want to see in your IMS is the capability or the the features that you're going to release to the customer, and then that needs to be related to your WBS. So hopefully that helps a little bit more with that question. So again, this slide and the next slide, you can look at the NDIA guide. I just took a snapshot or a picture to let you know that these are available in that guide. And there's also much more description about how to do performance measurement, or specifically take earned value % complete using the stories as QBDs. So I'll give you an example in a second, but at the high level, the epic or capability goes across the releases and is made up of many different features. And as the teams work on these features and complete the scope that's inside of those features, they're completing, of course, the epic. And that % complete rolls up to take your performance measurement at the epic level. And then the next slide that I have here shows the same thing, but the next level down, so the feature level. And this is where the stories make up the feature. So as the teams are completing the stories, in this case, there's just a few, just to show you an example of story A, B, C, and D. As the teams are completing these stories, at the end of sprint 1, we know what % complete they are based on the stories that they've completed. Don't worry, I'm going to show you an example on this next slide, which I think will help me demonstrate that. But again, I did want to point you back to that guide because it's very good. So in this case, I'm going to use our same unmanned aerial vehicle that we had talked about before. We named it the Vader. And in this particular scenario, I've got a couple of sprints here before my IMS update, and I'm using the Agile stories as QBDs. My reporting level, again, is the feature or the work package. And so what happens when the team doesn't actually get all of the stories done? Of course, they'll have more than 2, but just to use a simple example, the team got this 5-point story done, but they did not complete the sensitive data restriction story, which was worth 13 points. So what happens? Well, at the end of sprint 1, because they only got this 5 points done, I would take the total story points of that feature, which in this case is 44 story points, and I'd easily do the math. Well, they only got 5 done. They had planned 44 for the entire feature, so they are 11% complete. So notice I did not give any partial credit for this 13-point story. So as time moves on, again, the sprints are just time boxes. So 2 weeks passes and we continue to work on the next sprint and the stories that we have planned to do. And once again, this team seems to be struggling a little bit, and I would want to deep dive a little more into the why. But just to continue with the example, they've completed the step deviation as well as the limit data story, but not the control damage to a system. Well, what happens? Well, I would continue to add up all of the stories that they've completed. And at this point, they're 59% complete because they've completed these 26 story points out of the 44. And now I know you're thinking, okay, great, but what happens to the rest of the stories that they didn't complete? What do we do? We're at 59% complete, but now what? We didn't complete control damage or sensitive data restriction. Well, so we didn't complete these 2 stories. It's time for the monthly update. So what happens? Well, actually, what happens in the Agile tool is that those stories go to the product backlog, and the product owner has to reprioritize those stories. In this case, I'm showing that they've prioritized those 2 stories at the top of the next sprint backlog. So they're still working on feature A instead of moving towards feature B as they had planned. Now they might start feature B because they have enough capacity or velocity to incorporate or to add in some of those stories based on yesterday's weather. But in this case, the product owner has prioritized those 2 stories, and they've assessed the complexity of that remaining work, and they've actually updated their forecast on the EV side to make sure that they have a valid estimate at complete and estimated completion date. So I know that was a lot pretty fast, but the point is they don't get to just not do those or change their baseline or add budget or anything like that just because they didn't finish something if it's related to a performance issue. So again, the product owner reprioritized them, and the team will work on those 2 stories as part of sprint 3. Okay, and again, just the ETC really has to be valid, and the control account manager has to look at the remaining authorized scope regardless of that budgeted amount. So here's an overall picture of that same 44-point story that we were talking about. Again, they had a couple of stories they did not complete. They only finished 26 out of 44. So we're showing that that feature that was supposed to be complete is now only 59% complete. So clearly there's a schedule variance, and the control account manager needs to understand why the team is behind schedule. Even if they did part of these 2 stories that were not complete, they get 0%. And that's because it's all or nothing. You can think of it as like a 0-100 at the story level. Either it's done or it's not done. And obviously, this is contributing to the variance analysis that the control account manager will have to report on. So here's the other question that goes along with that. What happens when the backlog changes? Well, you're going to have teams that are going to add stories, change stories. This is a normal part of Agile and Scrum. The team is going to come up with new stories. They're going to change stories. And so I get asked a lot of questions about this, especially as it relates to earned value management. So what I ask the team is, do the added stories change the acceptance criteria of the feature? And remember, the acceptance criteria is related to that scope and those requirements. So if the scope actually changed at that next higher level of the feature, which is the work package, then we've got a thing that we need to address with perhaps scope creep or a baseline change is required. Yeah, so if the answer to this question is yes, the acceptance criteria of the feature changed, then let's talk about a baseline change. But if not, if it's that the team needs to perform an additional test, or the team is decomposing that work more, or something along those lines, then that's something that does, could contribute to backlog growth, but it's a forecast update. So you could see added stories, or it could go the other way, removed stories, changes stories. So this can be somewhat of a complex topic when we're talking about changing the backlog and how does that relate to earned value. But again, I always come back to this simple question. Did those changes actually change the acceptance criteria of that feature or epic? All right, so in earned value management, we have lots of reporting, but usually it's only at the end of the month. And so what I wanted to tell you here is that there's a lot of other reporting that's day to day. It's minute to minute, really. So the Agile tools are actually like a real-time snapshot of where the teams are at. You can do a lot of reporting from just a basic JIRA subscription. You can also add on to that, and many of the other tools also have more robust reporting. But you can see this day to day, minute by minute. You can set up dashboards, and Agile really does bring that additional visibility and insight into how the teams are performing. While earned value, it is a monthly status report, but it does give you that overarching picture. Like Jessica mentioned, typically in the Agile tools, we're really just focused on labor and not so much all of the other components, like perhaps long lead material or subcontractor effort or other parts of the project that are not using Agile development approaches. So both are good, combined is even better. Yes, and the dashboards are outcome-based. They're looking at the features, the functionality that's delivered, and they go hand in hand with the demos or the reviews that you're doing with the customer. So here's just a quick example of some of the reports that you can set up in Jira. I think most of you are probably familiar with Velocity. I know Jessica talked about it before, just about how many story points can the teams complete versus how many did they plan to complete. This one in the middle here is a burn down chart that helps to understand when the team will be done. It indicates the completion date. And in this one, you can easily see that, hey, we have 6 sprints left, and then you can compare that to the earned value reporting. So that's it. That's all I had for today. I tried to keep it in the time box here for you. The last thing I wanted to ask of you is if you could please check out our website. It's www.radicallybetteragile.com. Jessica and I do all kinds of Agile coaching and training. We offer Agile and EV services, and we would love to hear from you if you need help out there on your projects. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Jess, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to end with?
No, just thanks for letting us share what we know. And it was really good to be able to teach you guys about Agile and earned value.
Great. Well, thank you, thank you, thank you. And please reach out to us if you have any questions. And also there's a little survey when you click out of the training if you don't mind answering that. And thanks. Have a great day.
You're welcome, Susan.
Cool. How's that for a time box?